Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 418th episode of Constructed Criticism. I am your host, Mason, joined by my co-host, Abe. Abe, I've got to ask you, which would you prefer to have, a jet ski or a motorcycle?
A jet ski, probably, because I think they're more expensive than motorcycles, and I would just sell it.
All right, well, good to know my gift to you means nothing. Spencer, what about you, my other co-host of the show, jet ski or motorcycle?
I don't know if podcast listeners know this, but I drove a motorcycle from the age of 18 to 21. That's how I got to all my Magic events for a long time. I drove a 250 Rebel and a 750 Shadow. I have an agreement with my wife that I'm not allowed to buy another motorcycle until my kids are much older. But she has agreed to let me buy a Miata as soon as my kids are in high school. Or any other Sportster. So I pick a motorcycle every day of the week. One of the reasons that I liked it so much is I'm a total cowboy. Like, I rode horses growing up, and riding a cruising style motorcycle really reminded me of like riding a horse in a lot of ways.
Now we can cruise on over to the always improving section of the show, because this is the main topic. We're going all about power rankings for Pioneer later in the show, but we do need to do always improving. It is the main point of the show, and I am up first this week for always improving. This week's always improving moment really comes a lot from going in and checking out kind of what everyone else is doing and making sure that I'm not like falling behind on how they're playing for me. So I talked before about how maybe it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's hard to say. Time's weird. But I was looking at other stuff, seeing what people are doing, making sure that everything is the same. But I really wanted to go and check in and see how people are planning to attack 4-color, specifically in Modern, because one of the things that is a problem for beating 4-color is that it is really hard to actually sideboard specific cards for the deck. You can't bring in like Torpor Orb doesn't solve the problem. Blood Moon doesn't even solve the problem, really. These are kind of like stopgaps, which is something that is pretty unique to this deck in Modern, where typically, there's some card you can play that at least makes the matchup reasonably more tenable. Maybe it's not a winnable matchup, but it's much better. Really, for 4-color, it kind of takes strategy shifts and like building your deck dramatically differently or playing a different style of deck altogether. So I kind of went through, double-checked everything, and made sure that all that stuff was there. I think it's really important to be doing this, because if you're not like making sure that you're up to date on how people are sideboarding for you and you only look at main decks, which is kind of a trap I low-key fell into. I was looking at sideboards, but not really thinking about what they're going to be doing for me. You're just going to lose a bunch of games because you only really play at most half your games against their game one configuration, right? And you're more likely to play only a third of your games versus that. So important to know kind of how their deck is built altogether.
Can I challenge you on something really quick?
Sure.
While what you said is conceptually true, I find that when I'm playing a deck like 4-color in Modern, and what I mean by this is something that's so substantially the best deck that it's overwhelming. We talked about it a few weeks ago, where 4-color is like on the level of like green-white tokens was in Standard for those 3 months that it was dominant, right? That's how good this deck is. I find that when your deck is that good, that actually you do play against a lot of main deck configuration. Like, a lot of the things that they're trying to do are their main deck. They're playing this deck because they believe they have a good matchup. Now, if they believe they don't have a good matchup, you're probably playing against like 6+ sideboard cards. But I'm kind of curious if that was also something that you thought about.
It's a little awkward in Modern because really there's just kind of this squeeze where decks that are really good against 4-color have a lot of problem with everything else that's really going on that can really compete alongside 4-color. So it creates this awkward dynamic where people are kind of priced into almost accepting having not a great 4-color matchup and just having to do a bunch of sideboard stuff, or hoping that the matchup's like maybe favored 4-color, but it's not overwhelming. So, and they can kind of power through and hope to win the basically a bad matchup, which you have to do anyways normally to win a tournament. You can't win a tournament without probably beating at least one bad matchup. So I think things like Hammer Time, Murktide Regen, stuff like that in Living End put a lot of pressure on people and make it hard for them to try really different main deck configurations in order to beat something like 4-color, because, turn 1 Ragavan, turn 1 Esper Sentinel, turn 1 Sigarda's Aid Memnite is just like such a potentially back-breaking start, and it puts you in such a different direction than what 4-colors pulls you to answer. So I think that we see that sometimes, but those are often short bursts, and also on Modo specifically. And while I look at Modo data, I really try to build my decks for in-paper stuff, because it is often very, very different for paper and moto. Just a lot of incentives are different as well. So that was all I have to say on that. Abe, what was your always improving moment this week?
Yeah, my always improving moment this week was spending time working on specifically the Black Red Midrange deck and Pioneer and figuring out what I want to be accomplishing in the Arclight Phoenix matchup against a couple of different configurations of the deck that are floating around. There's not really quite a consensus on that deck as is, and so a lot of the times, if you get a sideboard guide or something from someone, or you think about the matchup, it's hard to know exactly how it is you're supposed to prepare for each iteration of the kinds of sideboard threats they have, what the numbers you want are. And so I spent a good amount of time focus testing against various builds that I had not yet played against, but were starting to become more popular. And then using that to kind of paint an idea of what it is I want to accomplish, the cards that I need to have to make sure I'm covered in these kinds of nuanced matchups where a lot can be different from game to game and from deck list to deck list. Between that and then also making changes to kind of the stock red-black list that have been showing up on Magic Online to adapt to kind of what I predict some of the paper metagame around me to be, and maybe, what people might be starting to do in paper based on kind of the flavor of the week. I know there was like the Metal War Colossus decks that people were talking about that were really cool. They were hot on Twitter for a couple of days, making sure I'm covered in all of the weird matchups with Pioneer and keeping on top of that while also keeping up with like the nitty gritty of the top tier. Both those things were kind of hard to balance with each other, but doing them both really helped me out this weekend when I was playing.
Can I ask what the conclusion was that you came to?
Yeah, so the big thing that was different for me this week was that previously in playing Red Black, a lot of lists weren't playing Young Pyromancer, or it was kind of ambiguous whether or not they had them in their sideboard. And oftentimes in the matchup, Bone Crusher Giant is one of your biggest liabilities because it's not very efficient exchanging with anything, and the creature itself is not very good against their creatures, as well as their count on like Thing in the Ice, their trespass count, their iteration count. Things like that can change a lot about the texture of the matchup. Overall, your game plan is always to try to make sure that you are in a position to not give them time to use all the cards they're going to get ahead of you with Treasure Cruise. But in this case, making sure that I was able to have enough answers to something like an early Young Pyromancer, how to balance that with the other threats that I wanted to play, making sure I had answers to, multiple kinds of game plans, one that were more aggressive on trespass, or were more just about trying to cruise me, ones that were more fixated on, winning the game with Jace in the long games. Making sure that I was prepared for all the different types of games and understanding how I need to adapt as a red-black player in the hands I'm looking at keeping, the hands I'm looking at mulliganing, the overall game plan I'm taking. That was really a focus for me.
One of the ththings that I noticed doing the power rankings today is kind of what you said. I was surprised by the amount of Phoenix, and we'll get into that later. But not only that, but because of the way that Goldfish does lists, you have to when you're making power rankings for a show like this, you have to click into a lot of lists because it's kind of ambiguous what they actually are. And the number one thing that I noticed is, holy crap, there is not a clear way to build this blue-red Phoenix deck, even a little bit. The only thing that is true is you're going to play Treasure Cruise, you're going to play Phoenix, and you're going to play Ledger Shredder. And that is it. That's it. Everything else is on the table.
And we'll get more into that here in a little bit. But Spencer, what was your always improving moment?
I was pretty sick this last week. I'm not sure, what I ate, but don't eat what I ate. That being said, I had some time to practice both Magic and Smash. And one of the reasons that I was practicing Smash was actually because I wanted to start focusing more on Magic. You might be like, Spencer, why does that matter? And it is because I now have a Smash podcast, Smash Through, with former host of the show, Matt Kling, that we do once a month. And I needed to pick a main. It's something that was really important to me. And I did finally pick that I'm going to main Greninja. I picked it for a lot of reasons that you could find out on another show. But the reason that's important is actually because of the way that I believe competitive endeavors work. By having this thing looming over me in Smash, I was not able to dedicate the time that I needed to Magic. By picking a main, it means that I can stop playing a bunch of other characters that I don't need to play. I can now just play Wolf and Greninja as my two characters. which saves you a lot of time. And the reason that that's important is because I talked about Mason about this before the show, but I'll just mention it now. I only get to play about 4 to 6 RCQs per season, whereas, back in the PPTQ days, I could play 20. I was conceding in the finals of tons of RCQs because I just knew that I would have a chance to qualify, right? And that won't be the case anymore. And because of that, I need to take Magic a lot more seriously if I want to both do the coverage that I plan on doing for Game Grid and go to the RC. This week, after solidifying a main in Smash, today I messaged some people, and I have started a local Utah constructive criticism testing team that I'll use my funds from constructive criticism to support. The reason that I want to do this is I find that I do better in that type of environment where I'm surrounding myself with people that I trust. This is pretty big for me. I haven't wanted to do this for a couple of years, from both the pandemic, where I took a break from Magic, to having a daughter. This is a pretty big commitment for me. And it goes beyond just the things that I need to do to prepare for this podcast and things that I need to do to prepare for a deck tech on the YouTube channel, or do a coaching session with people. It is much more about, it is categorically results oriented in some way. It's a pretty big commitment for somebody like me that thought that when I was going to do coverage a month ago, when I made the agreement that I was just going to give up on Magic. But as I was thinking about it more, I decided I don't need to do that. I just need to change my approach. I buckled down in Smash, which is something that's important to me, so that I could buckle down in Magic a lot more seriously.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's important to make sure that the things you're doing to succeed in Magic line up with your other stuff that you might have around life. And that might be work, it might be relationship, it might be, they might be Smash, right? But it's important to have those sort of things line up and, kind of work together because it's so much easier.
The thing that really solidified this for me, I was listening to a podcast called Tweak Talks. It's a Smash podcast by one of the best Smash players in the world. And my favorite coach in the world, his name is Charles. He talked about understanding your hobbies when you're the type of, I don't want to put Mason, myself, and Abe in a box here, but we're the type of people that when we have a hobby that we have, we're pretty likely to obsess over it a little bit. When you're that type of personality, you need to be really honest about your prioritizations. And for me, it was okay, I'm not going to stop playing Ultimate. I love this game, but I can't play 7 characters because it means that I'm not getting anything out of this game when I have to do all this stuff for Magic. Additionally, I'm going to take this away from Smash for a minute because the number of players that I'm hey, I'm really into TFT, or I'm really into Hearthstone and Magic, or I'm really into this other thing. It's hey, in all honesty, you've got to pick the thing that you're going to prioritize because eventually the other things are going to fall. And for me, I always prioritize my family and my job, which means that Magic is always third for me. And when that's the case, it means that everything else that you do needs to fall in line.
That's going to be for Always Improving. If you want to support the show, go to patreon.com/ccmtg. The show will always be free, but you get to do things like the Patreon question at the end of the show. And you also get a shout out when you join the Patreon, like for Keaton and Chase, who joined the Patreon in this past week. Spencer, you want to take care of some housekeeping for this week before we dive into the main topic?
Really quickly, I just want to give a huge shout out to our sponsor at Game Grid Lehigh. You can check them out at gglehigh.com. I did not realize that we would be recording this on the 1st, so I have not adjusted the discount code. I believe it's CCMTG10 to get 10% off your order at GG Lehigh. You can just click the link in the description. That's our reference link, affiliate link. I don't know what they're called. But honestly, I got to spend basically the entire weekend at GG Lehigh. We had players from Idaho, players from Wyoming, players from the surrounding states there. And what Jordan does there, what Joe does at GG Salt Lake, which not our sponsor, don't want to pretend like we're sponsored by all of Game Grid. What this franchise does for Magic in the Western states and what they're going to try to do eventually, the support that they're currently showing to MTG Summit, which if you haven't heard about it, check it out. It's in Utah. Abe and Mason, you guys should come out for it if you haven't heard about it. It's unbelievable. We are very lucky to be sponsored by the literal best place, in my opinion, especially after certain things have been bought by other places. the best game store in the Western United States at this point. I think that is how great Game Grid Lehigh is, especially for what it does for its own community. Also, guys, we have an open coming up. We got the CCMTG Open in 11 days from this recording. And we're going to have an open. It's $10 entry fee. Open deck lists, Pioneer on MTGO. And there are $500 in store credit to our sponsor, Game Grid Lehigh, guaranteed, with scaling price support after that based upon attendance. If you're a patron of $10 or more, you get in for free. I know a lot of people told me that they're going to enter this. I'm really excited to see what we can do. The top 8 will be posted to our YouTube channel with commentary. I can't wait to give out some dollar bills to our community, and I'm really excited for it.
Yeah, it's very, very exciting and very, very soon. So if you're thinking about doing it, make sure to check it out and check out the Patreon if that's the way you want to do it. Or if not, you can always check out the MTG Melee page for it as well. That will probably do it for our housekeeping. Let's move on to our main topic today, and that is the Pioneer Mega rankings. So just like the Power Ranking episode, Spencer just went through, looked at all the events he could find with top 32 deck lists for Pioneer. So all the challenges, all the supers, all the showcase, everything in between for Pioneer.
There were 3Ks and 1Ks that were RCQs and non-RCQs and opens too. So there was a lot of stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of events here. And we're just going to talk all about Pioneer for this episode. Starting from the bottom with the points and working our way up. I will make the caveat here that of the decks we're going to cover, both humans and spirits have been combined into one for their respective things. So it's not humans and spirits together. So it'd be mono white humans and Bant humans are one category, and mono blue spirits and Bant spirits are another. I would argue, for its worth, we'll get here later, that you could probably put Bant with the normal humans, because I think they kind of play similarly. And if you do so, it swaps your place. But it's all very exciting. We're going to get to that in a second. But let's start at the bottom.
Can we talk about how the points work really quick?
Yeah, sure. Do you want to go over that?
Just really quickly, because some people understand this is based upon an article that Fred Karsten did a long time ago about how you can rank decks. And so the way that we do this is it's scaling according to quote unquote record, which you can do pretty easily because Magic does Swiss pairings. So it's 6 points for first, 5 points for second, 4 for top 4, 3 for top 8, 2 for top 16, and 1 for top 32.
So with that in mind, the first deck up is Mono Red with 31 points. It is our lowest performer here, just barely with the next deck we'll talk about here in a second. But Mono Red is a deck that every time we talk about Pioneer on the show, we all have different thoughts on, and I always mention how it feels like the deck that is the most unrefined, despite so many people playing it. It can go so many different directions. Abe, I know Spencer and I have both gone on a whole bunch about Mono Red in the past, so I'm going to let you kind of start things off here. What do you think about Mono Red in Pioneer?
Mono Red is so close to being so good. It is a very strong deck. It's like a very solid choice for any weekend, but it just has some failings compared to other decks that are also proactive. Currently, it feels like the Pioneer format is, and we'll get to it, being kind of shaken out such that there's a couple of really, really strong decks at the top that all are naturally doing things that push Mono Red down, and Mono Red is kind of struggling there. But there are just so many good red cards and so many different ways to build this that I think that there's room for it to be built better and better every week, and options for it to play the right set of threats and the right set of questions for the answers of the format. But right now, that mix hasn't really been found. And it's also not able to contend with just, the amount of Fiery Impulses, Bone Crusher Giants that are being thrown around the format. And it also doesn't have a lights out matchup against anything that's really good.
Yeah, Spencer, what do you kind of think about Mono Red? Is there anything you kind of want to say?
I have a pretty strong opinion about this deck. One of the things that I put in the show notes here, and I'm going to make the show notes available because I put a lot of work this week into it, available for patrons in the Discord. Mono Red is one of the decks rising. So Mono Red, if you had looked at the beginning of July, it was not a high-performing deck. It was, I don't know where I put this in the show notes, but this had the most decks ever for a Mega Rankings episode or a Power Rankings episode in the history of the show. There's a total of 38 different decks if you include just micro archetypes. It was unbelievable. Mono red got 31 points by itself. There's no other decks included in this archetype. I think that something that Abe just said is really important. One, there are two decks that are extremely played in this format. They are Phoenix and Rakdos. If you looked at the total number of top 32s where they're not top 16s, that's the majority of Phoenix's points, for example. It got a lot of top 32s. And one of the reasons for that is, like, it's a solid deck. Mono red has about a 50-50 matchup there. It, on the play, is very good against that deck, and it depends on the number of fiery impulses and shocks that they're playing. If they're going more control-y mid-rangey, it's really good against that deck. If they're going more low to the ground to beat humans, right? Like, then it's really bad against that deck. Whereas it's just kind of bad against Rakdos, and we'll get into that later. I think that Mono Red has an interesting issue in this format, which is it has so many good cards that it's a good deck, but it is not clear how to build it. And if you looked at all of the Mono Red lists that were Mono Red aggro / prowess / burn, they're vastly different from each other. That will also be true when we get to Phoenix, and we'll talk about that. But, like, I think that's actually a problem for a deck like Mono Red. The fact that we can't find a consensus way to build this deck to attack the metagame means a couple things. One, which is a good thing, that this metagame having 38 or 36 different decks is wide open. Like, Pioneer is not solved. Maybe that will change when we get to the RC and the PT, but, like, right now, there's not a good understanding of how to build this deck. One of the things that Abe said during his Always Improving moment was about Bone Crusher Giant against Phoenix. In my experience, I don't board out Bone Crusher Giant against Phoenix because it's so good against most of the things happening to me. I need to be able to kill an early Ledger Shredder. I need to be able to, which actually doesn't work now that I'm saying it out loud. It does work because I'm willing to double spell a Ledger Shredder, and because it's a Bone Crusher Giant, but it also kills Phoenix. It also kills if they're playing Young Pyromancer. I have not dealt with the thing in the ice that Abe's talked about. Most of them do not play it that I found. But one of the other things is that on Arena still, which is where I play most of my Explorer / Pioneer, people are still playing Sprite Dragon. So Bone Crusher Giant becomes a lot better. On MTGO, that's not true. Nobody's playing Sprite Dragon. Literally nobody. There were 0 Sprite Dragons in a single...
It's probably important to cover now. This is one of the moments where it gets really rocky for me to talk about Explorer as Pioneer because the removal is so different that things like Sprite Dragon get to live. And, like, versus not.
The reason... I also agree, because if we look at, like, Mono Green is the most popular deck in Explorer by a substantial margin. And it doesn't even have Nykthos. And that being said, I've also played Pioneer Leagues on MTGO, and it's the most popular deck. Here's the thing. Mono Red is good against a lot of decks. Like, it's good against Boros Heroic. It's really good against Spirits. It's good against Blue-White Control. It's not good against Phoenix or Rakdos, and that's this deck's downfall.
Yeah, it's a interesting puzzle to solve. And it's also a thing where if you do make it good against those, you give up other spots, which is kind of the crux of it. Because you can build, like, if you're listening, you might be thinking, like, oh, my Mono Red deck beats up Phoenix. And you might legitimately be having that. But you're having to shift things so much that it's kind of this, like, you really have to build your Mono Red deck week to week, get to build it in order to stay on top of things, which puts you in a really odd spot. And then if you run into the wrong things or people do other shifts in the metagame because of their stuff, you find yourself in these awkward spots. So really what we need is some other last really good Mono Red card to come out, and then we can congeal the builds around one thing. We get one more really strong, powerful card. But we have to wait for that time to come. Otherwise, you're going to have to be really on top of things with Mono Red. Let's move to the Haterade section. Hidden Strings comes in at 34 points. I am actually shocked that Hidden Strings actually wasn't 10th. I knew it would be in the 10th through 8th spot just because a lot of people select to play combo decks. And Hidden Strings does have some legitimate strengths where, like, it can beat things like Blue-White Control really easily.
Hey, man, some people decide to play Gruul aggro instead of Mono Red. Otherwise, like, Mono red would have crushed it. So
That's fair, yeah. People should have just stuck to the red. But no, Hidden Strings really can beat up on things like Control, and it is like the combo deck right now. We're seeing things like Grinning Ingus pop up, and people are trying to explore that sort of stuff with like the Hazoret's Monument. But Hidden Strings is the premier combo deck in Pioneer, and it's really bad. It's a turn 5 combo deck that just gets disrupted by everything, dies everything in the format. The entire format is proactive or full of answer spells. And if you look at things like Rakdos Midrange, which is one of the more popular decks we'll cover later in the show, it plays discard spells plus creatures to attack. And then it has to play things like Go Blank and Duress in the sideboard in order to answer things like Phoenix and Control. So there's a lot of metagame factors going on that makes Hidden Strings, I think, actually the worst choice of a deck to play. And I'm pretty confident saying that if you play any other deck that we talk about today instead of Hidden Strings, you will on average do better, much like we talked about Rhinos in Pioneer. Sorry, Modern. That being said, does anyone here have a strong defense
I do.
For Hidden Strings?
Oh, not defense. I thought that I was going to be the biggest hater of Hidden Strings on this podcast.
No, it's really bad.
So here's the thing. I love Jerry T. I'm not afraid to like talk about other podcasts on our podcast. I think that the fact that other podcasters won't do that is weird. I love Jerry T and Brian. I think Brian is one of the best hosts next to Mason Clark in the entire world in podcasting. And I just disagree with them. I think that this deck is bad. I think that you should not play it. I think that it has... You said something really interesting. Do you actually think it has a good blue-white control matchup? Because like,
it's the only
how
matchup
hard
it's
is
good.
it? Is it actually good there? Because I watched this deck lose to blue-white control twice at multiple 1Ks by multiple players. So like, it can't be like over 60.
Well, it's Magic, right? No matter what you do, like,
well, sure,
like
that's what I'm saying.
35%.
But like multiple players,
right? But it's the only matchup where it like even looks to make sense to have a good matchup.
That
right?
makes sense.
Like that gives you time.
No, I agree on paper.
Yeah.
I'm just saying like I don't like this deck against.
Well, let me rectify my statement so that I can really hammer what Spencer's saying there, because Spencer's hitting on something here. I said blue-white control is the one thing where it can exploit, but I believe Lotus Field to be such a bad deck that even in matchups where they lack pressure and they can interrupt with you a little bit, it is still a deck that is not a functional thing to play across multiple rounds. So, I'm not surprised to see things like blue-white beat it, because I think it is that bad. I am literally telling you to sell your Lotus Field cards.
I actually think, for what it's worth, we'll get into this later in the show. Maybe this is my moment to talk about this. I actually think you can't lose to 5-color Nib with this deck. But I also think that deck's unplayable. You shouldn't play it.
Yeah, but 5-color Nib is so cool while Lotus Field's so lame. So that's the difference.
It's so wild.
I've got to step to Lotus Field's defense for a second here. Have you guys considered that it gets to play our Lord and Savior, Arboreal Grazer?
I would have backed you up.
Hold on. Green Red Ramp, while on the vast decline, also gets to play the card.
Yeah, I'm going to let you know a secret. You literally couldn't pay me to play Hidden Strings. You would have to get into like the Mega Millions lottery numbers in order to get me to play Hidden Strings.
It's on your ad nauseum.
It's on my ad nauseum, Team of Rhinos, Lotus Field. The decks
you don't
I
have
won't
to pay
play.
that much. I've seen the channel points on Mason's stream, and you don't have to pay that much to get him to play Hidden Strings.
I refuse. I refuse. Legitimately though, the deck is really, really bad.
I think that the fact that we have such strong reactions to it, for what it's worth.
I literally think you could pick any deck at random. You could pick a deck at random every week, and you would do better than Lotus Field.
Hold on. There's 38 decks in this, or 36 decks. You think a random 7 decks do better than this? I think that that's not
on the list. I said earlier, any deck on the list.
Oh, on this top 10?
Yeah. I would play any of those decks.
I think it is the worst deck in the top 10 by a substantial margin.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's really, really bad.
You are the Pioneer guy. I have to let you have more than 2 sentences.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I really have to say about Hidden Strings is that before, it was kind of existing in this world where the decks were not yet coming together in a way that allowed them to beat the turn 5 combo deck. And now they are, and you're still a turn 5 combo deck, and people don't even have damping spheres or whatever. They have worse interaction that still plays against you, and no one's really found a way to beat it with the Hidden Strings deck. It's not worth it. I've even known people who've tried to find things to do to make Hidden Strings in a good position to capitalize on the lack of sideboard cards, Like, I think Kane was playing around with some lists who we had on the show a few months ago as a Pioneer expert, and even they were not having much success. So if you like playing the deck and you play it really well, I'm sure you can win an RCQ with it. But I would think that if you can spend the time to learn to play a deck that complicated that well, you would find a higher payoff for your efforts. Literally anywhere.
That was a terrible defense. Just to be clear, if we're defending a deck, your advice was
my
if you're
defense
good enough
of
to
the
win
deck
with
was
this
that it plays Arboreal Grazer, sir. That is the only defense I offered. If you like the sloth,
I just want to be clear.
Arboreal Grazer is Mox Diamond.
Deck, the defense of this deck is it plays Grazer, but if you're good enough with this deck, you should play another deck because you'll win more.
Yeah, if you're good enough
because the deck sucks. You should just play anything else. I don't know how much more I can say about how bad this deck is.
All right,
I think it's
let's talk about humans then.
All right, so it's like best matchup is Phoenix, and they can't even consistently do that. I'm moving on. Humans.
Let's start with
came
humans,
in 46 points. I have a hot take about humans. I think humans is good. This is the combination of mono white and Bant. We'll talk about that a little more in detail.
It's more than that, actually. Can I cover this really quick?
Well, no, hang on. There's a lot of different human stuff. We'll get to that. I actually think we should have put Bant spirits in this category because I think the big picture version of the decks that a lot of people are talking about, like Bant humans, mono white humans, are very similar to Bant spirits. So if we did that, it'd be on top of the list.
Let's talk about this really quick.
Yeah.
I almost did company decks as their own category. That would have included angels, humans, spirits, and just a regular company deck. That's almost the category that happened. But the thing is that what would have happened is that mono blue spirits would have come in a high place. Mono white would have come. Humans would not have placed. Where humans would have been the band deck. Would have been the. Well, no, it would have been one up because everything would have moved up one. But basically, company decks would have come in at 8th or at 7th. Mono blue spirits would have come in at 8th. Here's the thing. The macro of synergies between your creature types was more important in the company versus non-company versions of your decks than the fact that angels existed. Do you guys disagree? This is a good, you can disagree.
Yeah,
That's
I just think that it's not so much that per se as it is that mono blue spirits is a tempo deck, and then the other band spirits deck is just a traditional Coco beat down, kind of a. I'm lacking the word, aggressive mid range deck.
I don't think that that's true. I do think that the Bant Spirits deck plays out very much like it gets a lot of what the mono blue spirits deck gets. One of the things that I had talked about in our Discord was blue-green spirits as unexplored. And it is possible that it's unexplored because Bant Spirits is just better. But I do think that because humans had 4-color humans, black-white humans, Mardu humans, mono-white humans, Bant humans, the human synergies was more important than the company synergy.
And I think that's fine. I just think that the decks play out very similarly. So when we talk about it, just know that the Bant deck plays a lot like the Bant humans deck when it comes to play patterns.
Can y'all go back 120 episodes and tell past Mason that he said this when he talks about spirits versus humans in Modern?
I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know what you're referencing.
You just said one of them was Splinter Twin and one of them was unplayable.
Yeah.
Bant
Spirits in Modern was really good. Yeah, it was really good for a while. And it created a play pattern where you held up things and they had to play into it. Now, through all this, I think the real strength of the human stack, I don't know how y'all feel about this, is that their 2-drops are just really good. Thalia, Luminarch Aspirant, and Thalia's Lieutenant are just 3 really, really strong 2-drops. And that's something that this deck gets to do is its 1-drops aren't so great. It has some really good 3-drops, which we'll get to in a second, but it has a nice little 1 powerful 2, pretty good 3 on average sort of curve. And the mono white deck does that the best at kind of exemplifying that, just because its mana works out the most. But we see this in the Bant humans deck as well, where they kind of have a similar thing, trying to splash for Experiment 1 and collect a company in a lot of ways, and then Reflector Mage. But Abe, what do you think about the humans deck?
Yeah, so the humans archetype is one that's obviously near and dear to my heart. I feel like every time I see a copy of Extraction Specialist, I had something to do with it. And maybe that's a little selfish, but the deck really is, like Mason said, held up by having a lot of the best 2s in the format, and especially 2s at attacking. Like, Luminarch Aspirant's very good out of the mono-white decks. The Bant decks that play Werewolf Pack Leader apply a very, very good amount of pressure, like following up Experiment ones. Reflector Mage backs those creatures up really well. Specialist means that for the games where people can answer your 2-drop, you're immediately back in the position you were, because a lot of the effects that you're looking at that are strong on your 2-drops, either Thalia's Lieutenant, Thalia herself, or Aspirant, are all cards that you get value out of simply by them being in play. Specialist does a really, really good job of leveraging the power of those, and the fact that so many of them are must answers over the course of a game, that you just have to deal with more copies of their best cards. And so, while I do think that as far as another angle of attack, we've seen like a lot of the aggressive decks, and we were just talking about it, how mono blue, mono red, and we're going to talk about another aggro deck pretty shortly here. All of them are doing their own thing and being their own angle of attack on the format, but I think especially the Bant decks are doing it the most with just their creature quality, and that lends them to be some of the best decks when it comes to Collected Company, because your Collect Companies are doing more. Your creatures in play when you don't draw a Collected Company are doing enough to keep up even when you don't draw your best card. And overall, you're really just leveraging your ability to constantly have a board state that requires your opponent to be keeping up. I think the mono-white deck and the black-white deck are pretty lackluster. I think that they don't have the staying power or the punch to compete in the format with things like Rakdos. Unless you're playing Pyre of Heroes, which I think is very good against Rakdos, you do wind up just not having enough ways to cross the finish line, or you play against Mono Green, they play a single Cavalier of Thorns, and you're behind the 8-ball. But overall, I think it's an archetype that's having good developments. I think that a lot of people are working on the list pretty actively. I see some changes every couple of weeks, and it's definitely like on the cusp of breaking through, but right now I think it's not at the level of competing with the top.
What do you think of Brave the Elements in the deck? Because you mentioned, like, specifically the mono-white deck, right? You mentioned how, like, something kind of gets in the way and it can't be beat. And that's an angle to this deck that none of the other decks, and some of the decks I talked about grouping with this sort of deck, have access to. It's like a unique angle. What do you think about that sort of card to sort of break those paradigms?
I have a big problem with Brave the Elements because there's not many decks where you're naturally unfavored, where Brave the Elements is doing a lot for you. There's not many times where like a board state is stalled full of creatures of one color, and then you're able to just resolve a Brave the Elements and attack for lethal because you stalled up. Usually exchanges are happening a lot. The decks that are good right now are going to be whittling you down on creatures, so your Braves aren't ever doing anything too swingy. And then even against mono green, if you Brave to push damage but not kill the opponent, they are threatening to combo you at a lot of positions. So it can be really, really tough. I think the card's just not in a great spot, but if we saw that the format kind of drifted back towards decks that were leaning on Anger of the Gods to answer aggressive decks, things that Brave naturally gains huge tempo advantages against, that's where I would say that that I would be more interested in mono white. But I think right now Mutavault and Brave are both just not cards that I really love to be playing. So
I don't know that I disagree with Abe, but I also don't know that I agree with him. The mono white deck, if we look at like the kind of the overall trend of this specifically, we see a really big decrease in some other aggressive decks, and specifically mono white having a huge jump in the last 2 weeks. And one of the things that I agree with Abe on is that I don't know that having no pyres is correct. And also, that means that maybe mono white is not correct. But I think that pyre might be better than company. And I can't believe I'm saying this because I thought it was like crazy a month ago when I saw the first person do this. Like
when you saw Abe do it?
You saw me do it? When you saw me make the fire deck?
Hold on. Time out. The other thing I was going to say is I want to give Abe credit for two things. One was Pyre, but the other was actually the one he mentioned, which was Extraction Specialist. I definitely missed on Extraction Specialist. It's a card that I play a ton of on Arena right now. Abe, your deck was black-white, right?
It was green-white. It was Bant-based with a single black-white creature.
That makes more sense. I think Brave is way better than Abe is giving you credit for. I'm also disappointed in Abe because he's like a boomer like me and should just literally know that any deck that gets to play Brave the Elements naturally just has free wins out of nowhere for no freaking reason at all. I think that we are seeing a huge trend towards mono white, and I believe that trend will change. I believe that the 4-color, the 5-color, the Bant, and the monocolor and the black-white deck will converge into a good humans deck. And the reason that I believe that is what we saw happen in Modern, is that there was a mono-white humans deck, there was a 5-color humans deck, there was a company humans deck, and we eventually saw humans become solidified in Modern. I believe that will happen in Pioneer. I do believe that it will end up being either Abzan or Bant, but that is kind of what I believe that will happen.
Y'all are much lower on mono white than I expected. I'm actually pretty high on the mono white as like the one. Also, Adelaine's a card that is really good in all these decks we haven't talked about. That card is very strong and very good with Thalia's Lieutenant.
For what it's worth, I'm not low on that card. I think Thalia,
I didn't think you were low on it.
You said I was lower on it.
I said lower on mono white. And I said a card we haven't talked about is Adeline.
I'm not low on mono white. I think that if you're going to play one, that's the one you should play right now because we haven't figured out the difference.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I just think the good mana and the curve outness is good, and we just kind of have to figure out the cyborg creatures and stuff. And there's stuff that people haven't been playing, like a good example is Welcoming Vampire, where it's stuff where it feels like people haven't actually looked at outside of white. I feel like I saw one person, the Welcome Vampire, I saw one person with a Selfless Spirit in their sideboard. And it's just because the deck is humans and it's a white deck doesn't mean it can't play things like Selfless Spirit to solve problems or like Welcoming Vampire to solve problems. So I think that there's a lot still to be done, but I really like how this deck just kind of curves out on people and puts them on the back foot and really makes them have to have an answer. And then gets to play powerful sideboard cards like Rest in Peace for matchups like Phoenix.
Just to kind of add on to what you just said, there was a second place list on a challenge that started 7-0. It played Containment Priest, Rest in Peace, Selfless Spirit, Atomic, Arcana Myria, and a second Extraction Specialist as its sideboard. White historically has had the best sideboard cards in Magic, so it makes sense why, Mason, you would love those sort of decks. The card that we didn't mention that I thought that somebody else would mention was actually Kition, Hero of Akros. I actually have always thought that the Gideon backside of this card was busted, and seeing it in Pioneer, honestly, looking at this list, if you just cut the Thraben Inspectors and play this card, I would just play this list.
Well, I actually have played this list a bunch, and I hate Kithian. It's just I have one Kithian because I want another Savannah Alliance, but I don't want them to get clogged. I kind of want to drop a bunch sometimes and then drop a Thalia's Lieutenant. And I have liked the Thraben Inspectors for actually outgrowing a lot of removal when one Luminarch Aspirant or one Thalia's Lieutenant trigger happens. And they actually outgrow just a bunch of shocks. So
that's good to know.
Yeah, it lines up differently in different places, but I'm sure there are going to be times where Gideon is really strong and the legendary part of it does not matter as much. So it's probably we mentioned earlier with a week-to-week thing. We spent a lot of time on humans, though. Let's move on to the sacrifice decks because he's coming at 50 points, with a majority of that being from the Rakdos deck, with a little bit being Jund. The Rakdos sacrifice decks look a lot like the Historic and Explorer ones you've seen. It's like Cat, Oven, Mayhem, Devil, Fable, Clan of the Firstborn, other one-mana stuff. These decks are very, very high synergy and have really strong late game payoffs. So Spencer, I'm curious, what do you think about the Sacrifice deck in Pioneer? It looks to have a lot of really strong cards. We talked about Claim the Firstborn was the best removal spell in Historic for years, and this is the best version of that deck.
Yeah, I actually think that this being a Claim the Firstborn deck is actually its claim to fame. We won't be able to get into this just due to the length of this episode, but maybe I'll cover this at the end of the show just really quickly, rapid fire, if Mason will let me. But one of the rising decks is not Jund Sacrifice, which came in with 10 points of this 50. It was Rakdos Sacrifice. Just really putting a lot of the pedal to the metal in the last 2 weeks. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One is while Rakdos Midrange, which we'll talk about later, has a bad mono-green matchup, I think this deck has a good one. I think this deck's quite good against that deck. That's a huge benefit for deck. I think it also has a good Spirits matchup. I think it also has a good Blue-White matchup and a good Phoenix matchup. I think that if you can figure out your Rakdos matchup with this Rakdos deck, you're in like a really good position. Here's the thing. This is not my style of deck. This is one that I would consider... Abe might disagree with me, by the way, of the things I just said from looking at his face, so I'm interested to hear his thoughts. This is one of the decks that I am more interested in than I have ever been, because this is not my style of deck.
The only thing I really think I might have disagreed with you on is that I find that these decks are really shut down by a Karn, and so I think the mono-green matchup can be really, really tough at times.
I do believe that is true, for what it's worth, because of the way that they were initially built, which makes me wonder. The thing is like, I mostly looked at the mono-green versions of the deck. They're still all playing for Karn. So it's like, okay, well, what changed? And I think it might be that they figured out how to play against the deck, where they get to attack the Karn more regularly. And they also, I think that they're playing more of the draw spells than they used to play. That's the thing I noticed, is they're playing the full 8 draw spells instead of 6.
Yeah, my feeling has been that Mono Green's metagame share has been slowly declining. I'll touch on this, when we get through the power ranking. But, when we have the full picture of the format, there's something like pretty telling about why that would be. And I think that that's led more room for Rakdos to have more of its good matchups. But, I think the deck is still strong. I think it gets to play a lot of the best cards in the format still, in the same way that Rakdos does. It's just a little more synergistic and has a lot more game against certain pieces of the format. So it can be a little more polarized in where it's good and where it's bad. Rakdos, which is kind of consistently solid against a lot.
Well, let's move on to Boros Heroic. Heroic came in with 55 points. Heroic is kind of like the classic deck from Standards Pass, where you play a creature and some pump spells and try and go the distance. This is a deck that we actually saw do really, really well when Mono Green was the most played and most represented deck. This deck preyed on Mono Green in a very similar way that Mono Blue Spirits did, but did in a much more proactive way. So when it had its best draws, the games ended very quickly and ended immediately. And so Heroic has there, but since then, kind of had moments of puttering in and out, and has been, as Mono Green share declines, so does Heroic, in kind of a symbiotic relationship. And so Heroic kind of has bolstered some of its results, but you look over all the weeks, it has not been staying quite on top of things. Spencer, what do you think of the Heroic deck in general?
So there was a version that I posted in our Discord for patrons that was very different. I still classified it under Heroic because that's what it was. But I actually think this deck is not good. I think it's the second worst deck on our list. And the reason I think that is because, you have good matchups, right? Like, you're good against Spirits, you're good against Mono Green, but I actually think you're kind of bad against BS. You're really bad against Rakdos Sac, you're really bad against Jund Sac, you're really bad against Rakdos Mid, you're really bad against, in my opinion, I could be wrong here because I have not played this matchup directly outside of a couple of games with Phoenix, but historically this has not been a good matchup against Phoenix. I think that this deck suffers from a really big problem, which is the second that people realize what they're doing against you. Hold on, and while I say this, we should have said this about Hidden Strings. Hidden Strings is really good if nobody is prepared for you. That's how I feel about Boros Heroic. Just like Boros Heroic, Blue-White Heroic, and Jeskai Heroic in Standard, this deck suffers from the same problems, which is the second that people realize that when you play a favorite hoplite, what you're doing, their entire game plan changes, and your games 2 and 3 are really hard. And that's not to say that the deck's not strong, it's just it just has a very uphill battle to climb, and I don't think that it preys upon enough stuff to climb that hill.
I think a lot of the ways when spirits, specifically mono blue, is good, this deck is probably also good for a lot of similar reasons where they've kind of put people to a test, with this deck being proactive, but also because it has more interlocking pieces than spirits, its fail rate is higher. So you kind of have to have things go more correctly than something like that. But Abe, what do you think about the Boros Heroic deck?
Yeah, I think the Boros Heroic deck had its best showings when the format was still at a point where people were not trying to interact with each other. It was in a unique position of being able to play good interaction for the cards people knew were good and were just putting in their decks, like Reckless Rage, and also having a game plan that punished people for not being good at interacting with them and just like being able to, steal games with Virtuoso or, turn one favorite hoplites, and especially being very punishing to green, which very early on was just, people were saying like, oh, it's the best deck, something needs to go out of it, it's so good, it's unbeatable. Hasn't panned out that way, but Heroic was a big part of that in being extremely punishing, and also having the tools to fight through a more minimal set of interaction and players who are not as prepared for that deck to be a deck on their radar when they were, mulliganing, building their sideboards, making decisions. I think it's still a strong deck, and I think it's, I'd say it's about as good as Mono Red in the format. Both have the tools to be successful, but I think that it's good matchups are really declining, and its bad matchups are increasing in a way that Mono Red doesn't really.
I agree. I actually was going to disagree with you really hard, and then you said that, and now I just mono agree with you. I think that Mono Red is gaining equity while this deck is losing it. I think that one of the things that I didn't mention that I wanted to, Mason, is that Mono Red is really good against BS, right? Like, just random stuff. The problem with this deck is it's actually kind of bad against random stuff, right? If all I'm trying to... Random stuff often beats aggro decks. That's like one of the first things that they try to do. But Mono Red has the advantage of having staying power and burn, where this deck does not. Like, I'm going to read off a couple of decks really quickly from the spreadsheet that are not mentioned in here, right? One of the matchups that I think that also was super popular a month ago that's not mentioned in this power rankings is actually Greasefang, which I think that Boros is also really good against. While they're a turn 4 deck, like Boros was big enough and fast enough to get through it, or Mono Red was actually really bad against that deck. So like that deck falling off favors Mono Red, but actually hurts this deck. But then like, some of the decks that we talked about that like are not very good, like I don't think that 5-color Niv is a deck that you should play at all. But actually I think that it's insanely good against this deck.
I think it's so bad. It's because of the mana.
Interesting.
It's specifically of a mana advantage on them. I mean, I think there hits a point in the game where if you stabilize to get to 5-ish mana, you can beat the heroic decks. But I think the heroic decks are so much more mana efficient, and the Niv deck is so clunky and slow with its mana that you actually can push through them.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for the heroic deck, the biggest uphill battle it has, in my opinion, is that in order to beat the heroic deck, you really only need to resolve one good removal spell, maybe 2. And that is a much easier hurdle to climb than something like Mono Red or Humans, where it's like, you need to present multiple answers because all of my cards are threatened, as opposed to cards that are being invested.
I agree. The other decks that I was going to talk about, because I do think that it was good against Greasefang, which is declining, except Abzan secretly has just skyrocketed in the last 2 weeks. But I also think that Blue-Red Creativity and Blue-Red Control are also really good against this deck. And they also are slightly on the upswing. Blue-Red Creativity slightly less. But like, Jund Sack, Rakdos Sack, like this deck just does not have a lot of good matchups.
Well, let's move on to Mono Green. Mono Green is the machine. When the format first kind of got the bans recently with Winota and Experts Federation, this deck very quickly rose to the top. And there's kind of a narrative, at first with Pioneer. It still kind of holds true where a lot of decks aren't fully built, or decks are kind of lacking that 1 or 2 more cards that makes them kind of cohesive. And they have a lot of filler in those sort of spots, right? Like you could look at the human stack and talk about like Dauntless Bodyguard is an example of a card that's fine, but you really wish you had like a more powerful 1-drop instead of something like that. And the Mono Green deck does not have that problem. Now, for better or worse, what you think about the power level of the deck, which we'll get to in a second, the Mono Green deck is a pretty cohesive deck. It has its 8 elves, it has its strong bridge spells, and it has its payoff in its end game, and it even has a combo finish in the deck, and has been getting some innovations in this past couple of weeks with things like Nico Bolas Godfarer as a way to kind of go over the top in mirrors, another grindy sort of matchup. So Mono Green came in at 59 points. It is one of the most consistent and linear decks in the format that is good. It has a lot of play to it, surprisingly. I think a lot of people wouldn't expect that from a Mono Green deck. But Abe, I'm curious, what do you have to think about Mono Green?
I think Mono Green is the 2022 version of Hidden Strings. And I say that because it is a deck that has kind of some innovation, like playing with Nicol Bolas. There's like 2 slots that can kind of really be messed with. But because of the concessions you have to make to playing a Karn deck, having Karn be a good card in the way that you're building your deck, you have such little flexibility between your game 1 configuration and your sideboard configurations that your deck is already about as good as it will ever be, and it is about the way that the format is able to handle that, and there's not a lot that can happen to change that. I don't see there being cards that are going to improve this kind of deck that much more, right? The only things that could do it are things that are going to find Nykthos more, or, somehow give you more devotion, or be a better planeswalker than Kiora for setting up your combo. There's very little.
Well, Vital Force actually just got added. Did you see this from this past weekend? The Nissa Vital Force to the deck. I would argue that Vital Force takes up the 2 flex slots.
Yeah, I've seen Nissa Vital Force. I've seen Nissa Shakes the World. I've seen Nicol Bolas. I've seen any random thing you could. I've seen like Pelucranos's, Voracious Hydras. There's tons of things you can do with these last 2 cards, but that's the only 2 cards you really get to negotiate on, And so, without being able to change much more than that, I think this deck is kind of close to its ceiling as far as how good it'll be, and it will constantly be putting a pressure on the format to be answered. You have to be playing a deck that has a plan for beating Mono Green, because it is one of the most powerful things you can be doing at the ground floor, in the same way that maybe 2 years ago, you could say that about the Hidden Strings deck, where it was putting a check on the format. You have to pass this test of, make sure that you can beat me trying to go off like this. In this case, it's Mono Green saying, all right, you have to make sure you can kill a turn 1 Llanowar Elf some amount of the time, that you can answer a resolved Planeswalker despite the fact that I have 1 4/4 in play, or, end the game before I'm able to storm the festival a couple times and put everything in play. So that's kind of my feelings on the deck. I think it's good, but I think that it is not ever really going to get better on its own. I think that the times it's going to be better are going to be the times that decks have stopped respecting it, and that doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon because of the fact that it's such a...
Spencer, I saw you kind of reacting to what Abe was saying. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh man, I feel like I'm about to lose like so many Twitter followers because I'm like the green guy. A lot of what Abe said is right, but I think that Abe's conclusion is wrong. I've been pushing a version of green that does not play Nykthos, that does play Karn, that is very different. I think green is in a bad spot in a lot of ways. I think that it has a lot of good things. I think that it lost some of its identity recently. And what I mean by that is, like, I think Golos is actually really missing from these decks. And the Golos package that really took this deck over the edge at the beginning of Pioneer, where it presented a threat that was so must be answered that it made all your other threats untouchable. And what Abe is saying about this deck, where, like, it's a Karn deck, it's true, but also, like, it should be a Golos Karn deck. And also, if that's what it's doing, why is it not the Eldrazi deck that we saw when it challenged a few months ago? I think Mono Green has a lot of problems. One of them is, I think that, like, they're way too focused on their devotion combos. I think that while it's really cool that you have, I think there's like 3 different infinite combos in this deck, if I'm not mistaken, they're just nonsensical. They come up, like, you can do them. I had a match where I was playing the green-red deck that I'm talking about on MTGO. I was playing against Mono Green. Game 1, they had 30 mana by turn 3. They totally won, and then they lost the match. I think that focusing too much on your Nykthos is actually hurting this deck. For example, I don't think that... what's the name of the 4/4? I should know the name of this
Old Growth Troll?
Yeah, I think this card's just bad in this deck. I think that, like, focusing this hard... One of the things that happened is people were like, Burning Emissary is bad, right? Because, like, it doesn't do anything. But it's like, okay, but like if you're gonna just try to nut draw people, it's way better than Old Growth Troll.
I think we have fundamental
hold
differences.
On. I'm not saying that Burning Tree is good.
No. It's not about that. It's about, I think that the deck has a infinite combo for free, and it's not trying to do that.
Oh, interesting.
I think you just kind of present a board, and you should just be attacking people, and sometimes you're like,
sure.
Hee ha ha, I got you.
That's true. And honestly, that is often, while you don't have the infinite combo in Explorer, that is what happens in Explorer pretty often, is like, you're just playing stuff. I do think that, like, the deck is way better than it's presented in the power rankings. I also think it's the most attacked deck in this format. It has an insanely good matchup against the best deck and a good matchup against the second best deck. And what's happening is that the best players do not enjoy playing this style of deck, and they are not playing it. That being said, I think mono green is not the answer, and you should play more colors.
I think mono green, kind of like, to put a pin in it, kind of like Abe said at the beginning, will put a pressure on the format, and it will continue to do that sort of in a way that like Affinity kind of did in early Modern, where you kind of had to have
I think
stuff.
It's Tron.
It puts a pressure on the format and makes you have to respect it in a way, and that will cause a lot of things. And the deck is very consistent, very strong, and it does a lot of things really well and breaks the mana system a lot and lets you skip ahead turns. And while the format is low power, doing things like Llanowar Elf into Old Ghost Troll into Karn is actually a very winning line against a lot of decks, and allows you to put a lot of pressure on people and stuff. And then the ability to high roll a combo or high roll these just nutty mana turns is just something your deck gets to do at very low opportunity cost to you. So I think Mono Green is a deck that I think is strong and has weeks, will be very strong, but it does kind of have, I would argue that Nissa Vital Force is sort of the end game between that and Nicol Bolas, where it's like, okay, now figure out how you want to do your thing, because Vital Force is a fair walker that is also Kiora for comboing. So if you want to do like Spencer said, and or how Spencer's just not doing, I should say, like Nissa Vital Force lets you lean that sort of way, whereas like Nicol Bolas lets you grind more. So a lot of weird things that can happen with the mono green deck. It's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. As we know, we get new sets and new, potentially powerful ramp cards, like Dominaria is known for having Llanowar Elf and stuff, and we saw a new elf get added, and maybe we'll get more cards like that. Regardless, let's talk about spirits. 66 points, half of that about being mono blue, other half being banned with a small bit of blue white in there. Mono blue spirits is a deck that I know you really love, Spencer, so I'm going to let you take things here.
Yeah, I think mono blue spirits has good matchups against a lot of decks. I think it's good against Phoenix. I think it's good against blue white. I think it's good against, I think it's insane against mono green. Its bad matchups are really bad, though. Its mono red matchup is really bad. And it's not just mono red, like blue red prowess is really bad.
Hang on, I want to talk about the Phoenix thing. You think you have a good Phoenix matchup?
Historically, I've literally never lost to that deck.
Okay.
That could be a me thing. So if you're disagreeing with that, so in one case, I'm 3-0 against the deck. On MTGO, I would have to pull up my data on ladder. But I think on ladder, I'm also 100% against the deck.
Do you mean Explorer or do you mean Leagues?
Explorer, yes.
Okay.
Explorer. One thing that has changed this month is the adoption of Fiery Impulse. Is that the name of the card? The 2-3 damage Spellmaster card. That was not true in Explorer or Pioneer a month ago, looking at the June data. There was some, but it was not as much as now they're all playing for. And I do believe that plus the shocks will give you the same bad matchup, right? When I play in paper, it is in Pioneer. I've never lost to the deck. I do think that there are some problems that Phoenix has as a deck that we'll get into later that I do not believe that Mono Blue Spirits has. Additionally, I don't actually know that it matters which Spirits deck you play. I know that Mason said he wanted to combine them. I actually think that they're all playing super similarly. I have played Company Spirits decks on Arena. I unfortunately almost exclusively play green decks on MTGO, but I don't think that it's that different. I actually would assume that both Bant and Blue-White... Here's the thing. The 1-3 that pumps your team...
Supreme Phantom?
Off the top of my head. yeah, is so good against Phoenix, like it's insane. So I would have a hard time believing, even though you're looking at me like I'm an idiot, that matchup is bad.
I believe that when you have a bunch of pieces of the puzzle, the matchup would be bad. Like if you're clogged on that sort of card. But why are you responding like that?
If you're we should talk about this off the show. I'm really curious why you just said what you said.
Well, it's a 3-mana draw 2 that's easily interacted with. The problem, I think, is that they kill your stuff, and then the Phoenixes come, and then the Phoenixes block, and the Phoenixes come back. Or the Thing in the Ice flips, or the Legislator grows. And so, like, all of the things kind of line up poorly there. That's kind of where I'm coming from on it. So, like, if you have a lot of the drawy cards, it can be hard because you fall behind. Abe, do you have anything you want to say about Spirits?
Yeah, I think the only thing I really want to say about Spirits, because I think Spencer did a good job of covering good matchups are, is that specifically Mono Blue and Bant, the biggest distinction I'll say is that Bant is a lot more like something like Humans, where it's trying to put a lot of power in the air into play and do some minimal disruption, because its clock is much quicker naturally by having all these lords and flying creatures. Like how we talked about on the aggro episode, about how that can kind of dictate how much interaction you need. The Mono Blue deck is much more about Curious Obsession and having these cheap flying threats that are hard to interact with, and rattle chains and things that are protecting an existing board state, and then trying to like cross the finish line just ahead of the opponent, and has a lot more interaction on the stack. So it's really good at punishing decks that are trying to play things that don't impact the board for a lot of mana, like Mono Green, right? So their biggest, most important cards like Karn and Cavalier, and those are both pretty susceptible to something like Geistlit Snare or, an Aether Gust out of the sideboard. A well-placed piece of counter magic in their entire game plan. And so Mono Blue plays a lot more like that, and has like Faceless Haven and stuff to close games, as opposed to Bant, which is much more like a traditional like Bant Spirits deck you might have remembered from putting a bunch of flyers.
I actually really love what Abe just said about this kind of that Spirits dichotomy, because it's actually why its Rakdos matchup is so bad, Abe, is because you have these natural parts of the mono green plan that when you disrupt them really hurt the deck. But then you look at something like Rakdos and to Mason's credit, Phoenix, where you don't have those natural disruptions. And when you don't have those parts that you can disrupt, Mono Blue gets a lot worse. Which is where I think that the part that you guys talked about, why Bant plays out more similar to Humans, comes into play, right? Where it's like, it's about disruption plus pressure. And I think that's really valuable insight. I do think that both Bant and Mono Blue and UI are all insane against blue-white control, which also is a huge benefit to the deck. It's funny because like people had this as like a D tier deck. If you looked at Mason's responses to his tweet like a month ago, Mason disagrees, but that's what I saw.
Oh, you're saying the people were saying that, not the tier list.
Yeah,
I was like,
not you.
I forgot that I had B.
You had it in B, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
right?
I had B or A somewhere in there.
Yeah, B or A. The funny thing is it's like, oh, I disagree dramatically with your tier list, Mason. And then I looked at people's response. I was like, apparently you were right, because people have this way off. I think this is like, it's easily top 5. I think it's top 3 macros in this format, which makes sense. Like if you look at the history of Pioneer and the decks that did well in Standard, how it affected Eternal formats, it makes a ton of sense.
Let's move on to blue-white control, because I think that's something that Spirits gets to kind of beat up on. It would be a natural kind of next talking point. Blue-white control is coming in with 83 points, and I think this is what I'll say about blue-white control and Pioneer, is that it has some really strong cards, and we talked about this a lot on the podcast. And back when we were about 3 weeks before Streets of New Capenna, I was really high on blue-white and Pioneer. And it had things like Teferi, the Wandering Emperor, Member Deluge, good interaction, counter spells. But since then, in the bannings, things have changed a good bit, where blue-white kind of has to adapt to what other people are doing in a way that we don't always see in Magic, especially in other formats. But we're seeing a lot here in Pioneer, and there's a constant coming up point where we're having to adapt to what's going on. But blue-white does have those sort of tools and does have a lot of really powerful cards, and just consistently kind of figures out something, is able to attack it and move on, and the other decks have to move around it, and does have some matchups that are pretty good, and has made concessions in order to beat decks that are causing it problems. So things like Rakdos was a really hard matchup, so they brought in Dream Trawler as like a big innovation in their deck to answer the Rakdos decks, which has in turn made Rakdos have to move around some. But we're seeing them having to adapt to what's going on, but being able to and consistently putting up results along those lines.
Two things I want to say. I love the 60 card versions. I think that they're substantially better. Two, I also think that like this deck is weird to say this, but it might be the most consistent deck in Pioneer. And I think that's for good reason. Like, it applies a specific set of answers and questions, and it gets to adapt. I think Blue Eye Control has been a staple of Magic for a lot of Pioneer's time in Magic when you look at standard results. So it was natural that this would be the best deck. There were Dimir Control, Esper Control, and Jeskai Control, and Blue-Red Control. This deck outperformed all of them, and I think that you have to have a really good reason to play any of those other style of control decks. When you look at just how good Supreme Verdict is in this format, where it's like only real answer is Spellqueller.
And I've said this a lot, kind of half in jest, about Blue Eye Control when I've been playing RCQs or helping people prepare for RCQs, is that Blue Eye Control in Pioneer is not a deck that gets to complete games. Like, the clock is its biggest enemy. When I play against it on Magic Online, I almost always like find myself fighting out a game in game one, which winds up with me being up like 5 or 6 minutes on the clock on my opponent. And in paper, I often find myself scrapping through a long game. Like, and if I win that game, there's only like 15 minutes or so, and they're not going to be able to win the game in time. So I think it has some pretty natural flaws that kind of keep it down just in the way that it's currently oriented. I don't know if there's a way to fix that, really. It doesn't have many cards that can allow it to get more proactive, but it has a consistent game plan, puts good checks on the format. You know, in fields where Supreme Verdict is good, it's good. In fields where the counter magic is good, it's good. It has a game plan against all the decks, which is to control them. Fairy's very good, and its sideboard like shifts are pretty good too. But you have to be like a special kind of blue-white sicko to really want to register this, I think, because it has a lot of issues with actually closing.
As somebody who literally looked at 37 blue-white deck lists today to make these power rankings, Abe is right. In fact, this is not universally true, but I believe in order for it to get a top 8, almost all of them played at least either 2 Shark Typhoons main or another, like, big win condition main. Like, almost none of them were straight random blue-white cards. Like, you were not winning on the back of 5-mana Teferi anymore. You had to have something else.
Awesome, great. Well, let's move on to our number 2 deck, Phoenix. Phoenix came in with 103 points. It's a 20-point jump from the last deck that we talked about here. And Phoenix is the deck that got hit with a ban in the most recent BNR and Pioneer. We saw Express Federation leave. We saw it kind of subside for a couple weeks. And then we saw Nathan Stewart and Piper Powell really crush it in I believe it was the Moto PTQ/RCQ. And then since then, the deck has kind of been on a resurgence, and we saw it kind of adapt to things like Mono Green. Since then, Phoenix is re-entering the metagame. People have started re-attacking Phoenix. We're seeing things like Rest in Peace have the Mono White Human deck, which they weren't playing before. We see a bunch of unlicensed Hearse, a lot of things along those lines, and we're seeing Phoenix really get attacked. But Phoenix still is one of the most performing decks and has one of the most consistent top 32 finishes across all the decks we're seeing here. And Spencer, I'm kind of curious, what do you think about the Phoenix deck playing the powerful Delve spells?
The ability for this deck to take an extra turn while also, if they don't respect that, getting to just recall is pretty insane. I'm going to say something pretty controversial. I think that this is the most overrated deck in this format. Almost all of its points came from top 32s. It was easily second most played deck in this results by a substantial margin. I think it is maybe a top 5 deck in the format, but I would be shocked if that were true. That being said, I think this format's really open, which means that this is an A+ tier deck. Like, it's very good. But I don't think that the 103 points being 23 points above blue-white, which I would put in the same category as this deck, is enough to, like, make me be like, oh, I should play Phoenix at my RCQ. In fact, I would guess most players at your RCQ have Phoenix on their radar. One of the things that I noticed looking at lists is the lack of Hearse in the 75s of decks in the last month. Whereas if you looked at June results, that was not true. A lot of people were playing Hearst in June. So I think this deck had a huge bump from the banning by people just disrespecting it, which is also maybe why Abs and Grease thing, which is not on this list, also had a huge bump. That being said, I think Ledger Shredder, Phoenix are two of the best cards in this entire format. Dig Through Time might be the best card in this format. So it gets to do a lot of things. I just think that it is... I'm going to say something and I'm going to get attacked. It's almost like Jund. Like, it has like a bunch of 50-50 matchups and not a ton of great matchups. And the fact that I don't think that it's good against mono green really brings this down a peg for me.
Yeah, I think it is just the Jund deck. Just has a lot of fair matchups where it kind of trades cardboard with people and eventually kind of takes over the game and attacks, and has a lot of different ways to be built. It has a lot of different ways you can sort of take things, and we've seen that in adaptive metagame, and we've seen it happen throughout its sort of life post expressive iteration, where with the expressive iteration it was so easy to solve all your problems. Now we're seeing things like, okay, is the format really creature based? If the format's really creature based, I probably want more Thing in the Ices. Whereas if maybe something like Mono Green isn't as big a player this week, maybe I don't want anything in the Ices even in the main deck, right? We're seeing a lot of different stuff like that happening in order to react to what's going on and try and sculpt your deck. And if you're not doing that sort of thing and you're jamming the same Phoenix deck, you're really losing a lot of points, and you can't afford to lose points with a deck like this, even though this deck does have a lot of incredibly strong cards. Things like Treasure Cruise are really, really good in Pioneer, and especially in a deck that's trying to actually trade cards with each other. And the deck really does do a good job of enabling that, albeit at the price of some matchups having to do things like strategic planning and pieces of the puzzle. Abe, would you have any thoughts on Phoenix?
Phoenix was like the best deck by a country mile when Expressive Iteration was legal. It was just constantly out muscling decks on like every axis, and then finding, like, seeing enough of its deck to consistently enact its game plan, having enough cards to interact with decks need to interact with. And even without just that card, the deck has gotten obviously substantially worse. The replacement level between strategic planning and expressive iteration is palpable, but it's still doing lots of powerful things. Treasure Cruise is still one of the better cards in Pioneer, period. Going up that many cards in a format where you can be making changes for 1 mana against threats that matter, that all adds up to the deck being a good contender. I think what sets it apart from the deck that we're about to talk about is that without expressive iteration, it now operates on an axis that is exploitable. And that's kind of led to it only being like one of the 2 or 3 best decks in Pioneer. It can be exploited, and when it is being exploited, it has weakness, and it's also not as consistent. But it is still, I think, a very good choice for most open fields of modern, or for open fields of Pioneer, because it does have a proactive game plan. It plays a lot of the good cards, and it's able to do its thing.
Yeah, I hope me talking down this deck doesn't convince people not to play it at like RCQ level events, because I actually do think that like this deck will win a ton of RCQs. I just also think that if people are prepared for this deck, it is a lot worse than it was.
Phoenix benefited a lot from having little hate in the arts. Now people are really aware of it, and there's a lot of narrative around it. So when you go and play an event, people are going to be prepared for you if they are any amount plugged in to Pioneer. Phoenix always gets brought up, which is the perfect segue. God, I'm so good at it. To the other deck that people won't stop talking about. Our number 1 deck by a country mile when it comes to the power rankings is Rakdos Midrange at 146 points. I believe 130 of those are for Misplaced Ginger himself. But jokes aside, Rakdos Midrange is the...
They're not. I won't accept this. No, they're not. No, they're not.
Derek won 2 challenges and top aided 5 other ones. He's a lot of the points. But regardless, Rakdos Midrange is the most performing deck when it comes to points in our system here. Rakdos Midrange is also the deck that is the most polarizing in all of Pioneer content. If you're anything like me, you've been listening, watching, and reading a lot of Pioneer content, trying to see what everyone kind of thinks to get an idea, because Pioneer is such a still new and fledgling format. There's a lot of thoughts and theories going around, and a lot of people think that red-black midrange is one of the worst decks in Pioneer. You will hear our good friends over at Dominaria Judgment with Ari Lax talk about how they think, fundamentally just not a good Magic deck. So that leaves us here. Where do we fall on red-black midrange? Spencer, I will let you go first. I'm seeing some looks in your face there.
I've never heard this opinion that this is a fundamentally bad Magic deck. I think that it has at times, at weeks, and for what it's worth, the results, if you look at them, show this, even in the last month, that it has bad weeks. But, it has, in my opinion, one really bad matchup in mono green, one kind of bad matchup in blue whites. Is there another bad matchup that this deck has in our top 10?
Well, so this is an interesting thing about Rakdos. Straight up matchups, I mean, sometimes things get complicated with Phoenix in the late game and sideboard plans.
Sure.
So that's kind of...
But that's like a 50-50 deck, right?
Yeah.
So that's not a bad matchup.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes they do things that make it a lot worse post-board, but pre-game one. And so there's a lot of things going on there. But this is the interesting thing is I think you can actually build Rakdos to where you're going to lose game ones against mono green every time and then win a lot of the post-board games. And I think that is a strength of this deck. And so I think that makes it really hard to talk
Phoenix
about.
while doing that?
I think you can beat like two of
Abe
three
says
decks.
Yes. Abe,
yeah.
Talk about yes.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I think you can beat two of the three, but I'm curious what Abe says.
Okay.
Yeah, so... While people were kind of doubting the ability of Rakdos Midrange's plan of all 3-drops to be able to contend in Pioneer, there's something that really stands out about Rakdos, which is that it is not an exploitable strategy outside of its inefficiency, you could say, about the fact that it is all 3-drops, but the entire format is somewhat inefficient right now, and that does not make it an axis on which people can really get ahead of you. That, I think, is really the telling thing as to why Rakdos has been this deck that has slowly picked up steam and become gravitated towards by people who play a lot of Pioneer as the answer to things, because while you might still be unfavored in your mono green matchup because you will probably lose every game one that you're on the draw, and you will probably lose a bunch of the ones that you're on the play, and then the matchup's still tough, you can position your deck with cards like Extinction Event by moving away from things like Chandra towards things like Hazaret. You can make your deck cohesive enough to apply pressure in a way that allows you to beat decks like Mono Green and Phoenix with the right set of answers and have a game plan that punishes the fact that all of the decks in Pioneer have somewhat of a fail rate if they're interacted with. And it gets to play enough of the good interaction. Fable the Mirror Breaker is one of the best cards in Pioneer, and it allows the whole thing to work. It's able to take enough of a flexible role with the cards it has in the matchups it needs to, that in any given matchup, it's not ever really out of it. It has the tools to flex and be where it needs to be when you present your deck in all of the matchups. And if we look at, even just this top 10, reading it down, Phoenix, Blue, White, Spirits, Green, Heroic, Sack, Humans, Hidden Strings, Red, half of those are decks that are trying to just do something to get under people. And that is not a deck that you can really get under. Between Fatal Push, Bone Crusher Giant, and the rest of the removal, Rakdos really has its bases covered there. And the deck's trying to be over it. It has enough staying power with its strong Planeswalkers, with things like Hazaret, Creature Lands, with Fable. It has enough resources to push through all of that as well in a lot of the games. So it really is a jack of all trades and master of none. But there are ways you can make sure it's attacking the right parts of the field for a weekend.
I have a really strong opinion after listening to it because, I had not been on the part of Magic Twitter, apparently. I mean, I'm not on a lot of Magic Twitter, but, anyone who doesn't understand that Graveyard Trespasser is, one of the best cards in Pioneer is out of their minds. It is good against every single deck.
Except for Mono Green. And even against Mono Green, it does something.
I was going to say, it's still fine against Mono Green. I've played a lot of Mono Green. Saying that this deck is all 3-drops is ignoring the fact that Fable of the Mirror Breaker is one of the best cards in the format, and then the other card is good against half the metagame. Bone Crusher Giant isn't really a 3-drop.
Bone Crusher Giant is the best creature hate spell in the last 10 years. It always kills 2 creatures. Here's
the thing. I hate this deck because I think that it is, in fact, the best deck in the format. And I'm not just saying that because, it has 143 points in the last month. I'm saying because, it does what Abe said. Whether you're playing Sorin as like another planeswalker or more Chandra, it has the ability to play so much. And a huge part of that is like its mana base gets to be like pathways, crypts, spell lands, creature lands. Its mana base is insane. Like it's the best removal, right? Like just Dreadbore itself is good in this format. It has a bad matchup. I think Mono Green is bad for it. I think that, you can build your deck to adjust for that, but I think that naturally, Mono Green preys on this deck. I think that if you ever play against like 5-color Niv, you have a bad matchup, but that deck's bad, and like your Thought Seizes might just get you out of some of those games. But like this deck is the best deck.
I think Rakdos is probably one of the safest choices to pick consistently in Pioneer. And I think it's funny. I think, especially if you're on Twitter, where you looked at my article maybe about a month ago now, I did a Pioneer tier list, and the top 2 decks I put at the time were Mono Green and this one. And then the next decks I put were Blue-White and Arclight Phoenix. And I got a lot of crap for a lot of that stuff. But as we kind of see time play out, they sort of play out like that. And the reason Rakdos was high is because everything we said here, where Rakdos is consistent. Rakdos does just do its thing every time, and you can't really break it up, and it breaks up the other decks, and the other decks are doing things that it breaks up. And that is a really strong place to be. And I mentioned this earlier, I kind of laid my Chekhov's gun, if you would. And I said, like, every deck is sort of like 1 or 2 cards short of being like a really coherent deck. And when that happens, there's a lot of pressure on your power cards to be really powerful. So when you thought these are pieces of the puzzle, that has huge implications for the Arclight player. It's hard for them to get Arclights. It's hard for them to delve. Those sort of things, when you can break up strategies like that, have lasting ramifications. And I played Rakdos midrange for the first time in paper this past weekend. I was very happy with my deck choice. And I think that if I had just played better and actually had all my cards with me and not had to scrap to grab 75 red-black cards, I would have done very well. And I intend to play Rakdos going forward in a lot of events.
You know what, man? Life-Bane Zombie, huge innovation for this deck. Like that, this wasn't playing this card a month ago, right? Like people just assume that because it's not Jund, it's not good, right? Like they just equate green with being the thing that pushes the mid-range deck over the edge. And that's just not true with this deck. It's honestly the red cards that do it.
I think the other thing that this deck has going for it, and this is an interesting sort of thing, is that there are not a whole lot of people who are doing a lot of hyper spiky, competitively focused Pioneer content. And, think what you will of Derek. He is literally always streaming red-black, always playing it, and always trying new cards. And he's changing cards constantly to get how they feel. And so you'll see him play Hazoret. And I messaged him, like, why are you playing Hazoret? Like, what's going on? He's like, oh, yeah, like, Phoenix can't beat that. And then he, like, changes because he thinks, like, Phoenix is going to be lower in the metagame. And he plays, like, a bunch of Extinction events. And he's like, oh, yeah, every card in Mono Green is odd. So I, like, found Extinction event. Or, like, I Life-Bane Zombie. And so there's a lot of work being done on this deck. And that is something that's big. I expect once we get to the RC, and I think some people are playing their cards sort of close to the chest. Like, I literally know people who feel like they have a lot of good stuff but are holding it. That sort of thing will change, maybe. But for right now, that's all we can talk about is now. And, there's just a lot of good work being put in on the Rakdos deck. And we see it just crush the challenges. The time of this recording, it was for 3 of the 4 final slots for the challenges and won both of them. So Rakdos is doing pretty good right now, I would say.
Yeah, I really want to hammer home something that I said when I led on what I was saying about red-black, which is that the deck is not exploitable. And right now, in Pioneer, the best way to get wins is to exploit a weakness in your opponent's deck, because all of the decks do have weaknesses. And something that we see actually in 4-color, which makes it such a dominant best deck right now in Modern, is that it doesn't have cards that even in the entire card pool of Modern can really effectively knock out its game plan. So it's an incredibly resilient mid-range. It just does the thing and will constantly slog because all of its cards lend itself to that game plan. And in a similar way, on a much smaller scale, I think Rakdos benefits from a similar set of conditions, where its best cards are just good enough, and there aren't ways to really shut them out. And when they have things like Fable and Blood Tithe Harvester that really increase their consistency, the amount of cards they see a game, when they have, just good interaction, it adds up to a deck that is surprisingly resilient to being squashed. It's like a cockroach. that's really my final feelings, and what I think is most important about why Rakdos is the top dog right now is that I think that there aren't really strategies that have been found to contend with the rest of the format and get over Rakdos specifically.
Yeah, put a lot of pressure on the format. That's going to do it for our main topic here today. There is a lot going on in Pioneer. There was a bunch of things we could have talked about. Like, Spencer listed a bunch of decks that have been doing worse as weeks have gone on with like Boris Heroic, Niptolite, Gruul Ramp, Hidden Strengths. Those are all things that were doing well before and are kind of falling off now. We see, rising stuff like the Rakdos Sacrifice deck try to be a more synergistic version. We're seeing various versions of Human Spirits, Greasefang with the newly innovated Abzan deck. We're seeing, Ascendancy. We're seeing Grinning Ignis start to show up as well. So there's a lot of stuff happening in Pioneer, and it's still all being formed. And that's kind of why we're saying all the things we are saying about Pioneers. It's still a blossoming and flourishing format. There's a lot of things we figured out and a lot of room to innovate. Feels like every one time someone says, yeah, like there's nowhere else we can go in Pioneer, something gets figured out, and that's a really exciting part of the format. But we need to move on to our Patreon question of the week. If you want to support the show, go to patreon.com/ccmtg. The show will always be free, but if you would like to get back to the show, you get to get in our Discord, which is pretty cool. A lot of people talking about stuff. We have like a little cheer squad channel for how people events are going on. People are testing in there. People are talking in there. You also get to ask questions like this one on the show. Chase asks, if Magic had a walk-up music, like in baseball or wrestling, what would be your walk-up song? I will go first. Mine would be Massacre by Kim Petras. That is mine. Spencer, what would yours be?
I can't pick one, so I'm just going to name them really quick. Uptown Funk was the one that I was listening to on repeat when I won my RCQ. When I won states the first time, it was Taylor Swift's, yeah, that's right, Mean, because of the way that I was treated in Utah. And then more recently, it's been Me Too by Meghan Trainor.
I'd be one of those guys who changes their walk-up music every week. I'm huge on making playlists, but I think if I had to go with one stable one, I'd go with Rigor Mortis by Kendrick. Just a solid walk.
I think that you should just use the Digimon movie soundtrack, Abe, like in order.
That is an incredibly good soundtrack, but I don't think they're really good walk-ups.
Coolest thing I ever saw. Another way to get a question on the show is to go to YouTube and leave a comment on the last week's episode. I guess there wasn't one this week, so Spencer put something here.
That's not true. I left a comment on our parent.
Yeah,
this is just false. I used our parent company's YouTube to leave this comment, but actually, this was not last week. It was actually the week before, but I was really sick last week while we were recording, so I didn't have time to bring it up because I was going to just throw up recording last week's episode. I just want to give you two a huge shout out and Quentin a huge shout out that I was really sad to miss talking with somebody that I just consider like a big brother. And I honestly thought that it was one of the best episodes of CC ever. And I definitely cried listening to you guys talk to Quentin about always improving. Quentin is just one of the most humble human beings I've ever met. He is part of the testing team that we just organized today. One of the number one things I told Quentin before coming on the episode is hey, we have this running joke where because you did well before Mason with Mason's list, that it's your list. And then the first thing he said on the show is that he just asks Mason for lists. And I was like, you betrayed me. You're a traitor. But honestly, that's just the type of person that Quentin is. And the way that you guys interacted with him. And honestly, if Quentin could just replace me on this podcast, I think it would be a better podcast because of the way that you two interacted with him. He was amazing. And there's a world in which some certain life stuff doesn't happen, and that this show is still Quentin and Spencer. And hearing his success after coming back to Magic, honestly, just the way that you two talked to him it is my favorite episode of CC. And it's probably because I wasn't on it, but it meant a lot.
Awesome. I'm glad you were able to enjoy that show, and I hope the listeners got something from it too. Make sure to check out the rest of the network. They might get something from those shows as well. You want to check out Common Knowledge, a Popper podcast, all about that format. You want to also check out Drafting Archetypes with Sam Black. It is a limited focus podcast. You want to check that one out as well. If you want to support the show, we talked about the Patreon and everything like that. But another way is to subscribe on YouTube, leave reviews, comments, and tell your friends about it. If you enjoyed the show and think they might get something from it, that's a great way to help us without having to give any dollars, and it's super helpful when it comes to the old metrics, and the metrics decide if we get pushed or not on the YouTubes. So that's awesome. If someone wants to find us, though, outside of the podcast, Spencer, where can they go to find you?
Yeah, I'm Spencer13H on Twitter. I do 3 podcasts. I do this one. I do the Smash 3 podcast once a month with Matt Kling. And then I do every other week Need to Nerd with Patty B and TG. As well as now I do the commentary for the Game Grid Lehigh, our sponsors, 1K Plus events. And you can find those on my stream at Heezy Media on Twitch. Also, I saw the need for this after multiple people asked me, and I'm finally doing it, but I am offering career coaching for specifically Magic players. If you want it, the first session is free. The first session is just a review of your resume. It is completely free. The second session, which I believe is far more important, is LinkedIn coaching, and then interview and career coaching after that. LinkedIn coaching costs $100, to be clear. It's pretty important, and then the prices will vary after that. But I think that one of the things that I can do to help Magic players the most is to help them in their career, and the number of Magic players that I see settling for things that they are far better than is way too much. You are smart enough, strong enough. I can help you with interviews. I can help you with a lot of stuff. But let's look at your resume and let's make sure that you're ready for it. I did get some stuff on Magic coaching, but I would rather do this first. So,
Abe, what about you?
Find me over at twitter.com/morenothings. Still doing coaching for Hammer Time and all things Pioneer. So, yeah, if you are looking for that, you can reach out with a DM on Twitter, and we can set something up.
You can find me each every week here. You can find me over at Card Kingdom, writing about something going on in Magic. I believe this week is also a Pioneer tier list, so you can expect that, and deck list for everything. You want to check that on out. If you want to get coaching, I do offer coaching for all various things, from 4-color, which is something that I get hit up a lot about. I do that, as well as just general Magic stuff. I will say, if you're looking for 4-color, my 95s won the last 2 energies back to back. You know, people just take my list and win card for card. They get the sideboard guide. It goes well for them. You might want to consider doing that. So you want to check that out. You can reach out to me on Twitter at Mason E. Clark and inquire about that, or reach out to me via email at masoneclark@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening to this week's episode of Constructed Criticism. We'll see you all next week for another episode of CCMTG.